In den zurückliegenden Vorlesungen des Wintersemesters haben wir uns mit Aspekten der Hirnforschung, der künstlichen Intelligenzforschung, der Ägyptologie und des Filmemachens befasst. Heute geht es zur Abwechslung wieder einmal um die Perspektive der Kunstwissenschaft auf das Thema Bild und Bildlichkeit. Der Referent des heutigen Abends, der Kunstwissenschaftler Kemp, leitet an der Universität Oxford ein Institut, dessen Namen man durchaus als Programm verstehen kann: Center for Visual Studies. Auf der Webseite des Centers for Visual Studies liest man den erstaunlichen Satz: The center is potentially concerned with the visual analysis of anything that has been produced as a result of human artifice, ranging from a stained glass window to the latest computer graphics. Das klingt einigermaßen ungewöhnlich für die Webseite eines kunstwissenschaftlichen Instituts. Die Breite des Ansatzes, mit dem sich das Center for Visual Studies befasst, ist in der Tat erstaunlich. Our concept of art, heißt es da, is relatively recent and cannot be applied safely to artifacts from other cultures. Wir haben ja demnächst Frau Schimmel hier. Objects that apparently lie outside even an expansive definition of art can be subjected to visual analysis in such a way as to open important doors to the understanding of their origins, reception, place in society, and subsequent history. The mission of the Center for Visual Studies is to use, extend, and develop existing modes of visual analysis and to forge innovative tools for the understanding of visual cultures in their wholes and parts. Das Mission Statement des Center for Visual Studies klingt, als sei die zukünftige Bildwissenschaft, an der an unterschiedlichen Instituten zurzeit geforscht und gefeilt wird, hier schon vorweggenommen. Wir werden darüber hören. Kemp bringt mit seinem heutigen Thema einen neuen Aspekt in unsere Vorlesungsreihe hinein. Er spricht über die Beziehung zwischen Kunst und Wissenschaft. Beide haben in den letzten Jahren ein wachsendes Interesse aneinander gefunden. Das weiß ich aus eigener Erfahrung mit den Arbeiten der Akademie. Künstler zeigen sich zunehmend interessiert an der Seh- und Interpretationsweise von Naturwissenschaftlern. Umgekehrt finden sich mehr und mehr Naturwissenschaftler, die die intuitive Herangehensweise von Künstlern für interessant, eben auch für ihren eigenen Blickwinkel halten. Optimisten könnten hier ihren Wunsch bestätigt sehen, dass sich Künste und Wissenschaften einander wieder annähern. Ich persönlich glaube daran nicht. Ein Zurück zum Zustand harmonischer Einheit, wie er zu Zeiten Leonardos herrschte, kann es in einer Zeit, wo das Spezialistenwissen naturwissenschaftlicher Fächer nur noch von hochspezialisierten Eingeweihten verstanden werden kann, wohl nicht mehr geben. Beiden, den Künsten und den Wissenschaften, liegt aber natürlich derselbe Zeitgeist, dieselbe Lust auf Neues und eine ähnliche Sicht auf die sie umgebende Welt zugrunde. Insofern kann es durchaus Sinn machen, die Bildkonzepte, die beide für die Repräsentation ihrer Ideen und Visionen entdecken, einer genaueren Betrachtung zu unterziehen, wie Kemp dieses tut. Moderiert wird der heutige Abend von dem Kunstwissenschaftler Hubertus Kohle. Er ist geschäftsführender Direktor des Departments Kunstwissenschaften der LMU. Ich habe das auf ihrer Webseite nachgesehen. Ich wusste gar nicht, dass es ein Department Kunstwissenschaft gibt. Aber ich bin froh, dass ich es jetzt weiß. Ich freue mich sehr, Herr Kohle, dass Sie den Vortrag des Kollegen Kemp moderieren werden. Sie haben mit der digitalen Kunstgeschichte und der Tagung, die Sie in diesem Sommer zu dem Thema veranstaltet haben, an der LMU ein innovatives kunstwissenschaftliches Konzept kreiert, das dem Fach sicher einige neue Möglichkeiten erschließt. Am Saxophon hören Sie heute Abend Slavin, und weil es heute die letzte Vorlesung im ablaufenden Jahr ist, möchte ich auch nicht versäumen, Ihnen ein schönes Fest und ein gutes neues Jahr zu wünschen und darf jetzt Herrn Kohle bitten.
artistic talents pass for scientifically ungifted. Scientists look at artistic life in a mixture of mockery and lack of understanding. Art, that's the idea, is pure activity of the soul. Science, pure activity of the head. Art is human, science, of course, necessary, but also somewhat of an alienation. Art controlled by intuition, science by the intellect. One could find a lot of additional polar characterizations that add up to the same result. Many reasons for this constellation can be found in history. When art was finally and parallel to the birth of the discipline of aesthetics in the 18th century established as an independently organized system, the dissociation of art and science was well underway. What art gained in autonomy during this process is it lost with regard to its integration into other ways of appropriating the world, especially the scientific ones. When we observe attempts to build new bridges towards the natural sciences, especially in media art, working with the technically most advanced means, this will have to be understood as a critical reaction to the development I briefly tried to outline. And when media artists tend to argue with the most sophisticated theorems of natural sciences, they answer to more traditional ways to define art as a spiritual activity. As a critical reaction, we also have to understand Martin Kemp's large art historical production, treating especially the period of early modernity from the Renaissance to the 19th century. Both in a systematic as in a historical regard, he has recalled the close structural and factual relationships between art and science. He did this, for example, in The Science of Art, one of his magna opera, treating optical themes in European art and enthusiastically welcomed by his colleagues. The book has given new insights, especially in the history of color theory and perspective, and it has comprehensively shown the thorough amalgamation of artistic and scientific discourse in early modern Europe. One of Kemp's central theses says that there are multiple and deep parallels between the scientific and the artistic activity, that the way of both to come to terms with the outer world is structurally similar. Therefore, art once very naturally used scientific procedures, or what we call now scientific procedures, as its own means, and it often contributed itself to scientific results. And science presented its results in forms we now perceive as artistic. Contrary to usual expectations, Kemp stresses the fact that science is as dependent upon intuition as art, and that scientific statements and its visualizations are subject to aesthetic criteria as are artistic formulations. And with Leonardo da Vinci, he put an artist in the center of his researches who most programmatically identified artistic and scientific activity, who probably wouldn't even have understood the difference we now make between the two. Following a tradition especially vital in England, where university disciplines have often been eager to act upon the public sphere, Martin Kemp himself first educated in a scientific discipline, later on professor in St. Andrews, Scotland, at several important American universities and now in Oxford, has organized several internationally renowned expositions. First of all on his hero Leonardo, and lastly on the spectacular bodies, where modeling in wax and physiognomics, anatomical studies and dissection were exposed, practices and fields where artists delved into science and science served artistic ends. Better than anywhere else, the shifting borders between art and science can be observed here. What now seems to be totally outside the realm of art has been an integral part of it well into the 19th century. And therefore, if younger colleagues now begin to work on such strange fields as wax figures, early newspaper illustrations, or illustrations of scientific travel reports, we should not tell them that this is outside the realm of art, but we should encourage them to go on accepting the fact that our traditional ideas of art are quite restricted and coined by quite recent aesthetic developments. A wider public here in Munich has come to know Martin Kemp in 1999 on the occasion of a most spectacular exposition on Leonardo's Codex Leicester, acquired by Bill Gates, which made that even more spectacular. The written comment was Kemp's, and it was published on a CD-ROM, which is definitely one of the most well-done electronic publications on an artistic topic ever produced. Many of you will even remember to have been deeply impressed by the Codex itself, but actually not to have understood very much of it, if not by using the transcriptions and explanations on the CD-ROM. You will remember that it's extremely hard to read what Leonardo wrote in that Codex. What we are now going to hear falls into line with a series of articles written by Kemp and regularly published in Nature, arguably the most famous scientific journal worldwide. I stress scientific, of course. An art historian who writes for the most advanced scientific journal. These articles have partly been republished 2 years ago in a book called Visualizations, the Nature Book of Art and Science. I would recommend a reading of this collection of jewel-like miniatures as an ideal amplification of what will be presented tonight. If a German publisher could make up his mind to bring this book in German, he would not only present this to a wider audience, he would also give an impressive example of a scholarly practice fulfilling in the best possible way the program of the so-called Wissenschaft, universally discussed in German art history, but still very rarely practiced. Kemp's contribution would especially show the central importance of historical insight, which in some of the German variants of this new discipline tend to be lost, or at least underexposed. Dear Professor Kemp, we are looking forward to hear your lecture, and I promise you all those who didn't come for the subway strike today will deeply regret not to have done so. Welcome, Professor Kemp.
I think the first thing I should do is to congratulate the audience on getting here. Though this is slightly worrying, because if it's easy to get to a lecture and it's not very good, then probably you're not too discontented, having made all the effort to get here in the face of the strike. Obviously, you've tried hard, so I have to try even harder. It would be customary on these occasions to thank sincerely the motivating person behind this series. As you all know, Dr. Hubert Burda. In this instance, the thanks seem rather inadequate given the circumstances of his endowing. And I find it extraordinarily moving to think that the death of a son can heroically result not in looking back, but looking forward. It's an act of courage on his behalf, on Christa Ma's behalf, of extraordinary, exemplary character. And it is extraordinarily moving for me, speaking in this particular context. In setting up the lecture, I think Dr. Burda wouldn't mind my mentioning our mutual friend, George Weidenfeld, who I think has been the kind of link between the two of us. A benefactor of Oxford and a great fixer on his own behalf, and a great inspirer of learning and tolerance. I thank the university for hosting this in this magnificent hall, and Hubertus Kohle for his remarks, which I fear may have set up expectations that I'm ill-equipped to fulfill. In fact, Hubertus, I think you should have given the lecture yourself. You do it so much better than I do. But thank you. The invitation to give the lecture has come at a good time, because it's given me a chance to look back again over the pieces, 600-word pieces, with generally one illustration in the science magazine Nature. Could I have the first two slides, please? The first two slides? Okay, we're in business. The first 2 years, at that point I was writing on a weekly basis, which I don't run out of topics, but it is something of a tyranny producing one article a week, were brought together in the book, which Hubertus has already referred to, Visualizations. And there was a German translation mooted. I'm not quite sure what happened to it. And that was published 2 years ago, and there have been another series coming from them. So it's good to be able to reflect back and to share some thoughts as to whether there is anything more than a series of separate, discrete essays, which they obviously have to stand on their own, but are there things which, looking back, can be brought together, can be drawn out? Nature, as we know, is an incredibly distinguished periodical, 1869 its foundation, as you see on the left there, undergone many reincarnations, and now in the more modern reincarnation. And incidentally, as a visual historian, one of the things I'm interested in doing is asking, why does nature, as it is on the left, that design, why does it look like it does? And why does the one on the right look like it does? I'm not going to tackle that here tonight. I did write an essay on visualizations on this topic, but it's a serious question. Why do things look like they do? It's an obvious question, but we can ask it of anything which has been made by human beings, anything which is designed in some shape or form. And there is a special message carried by each of these structures. Sorry, I'm missing a slide here. Here, the recent page, one of the recent cover pages. An extraordinary progression between the 1869 one and this one. Not necessarily a progression for the better or for the worse, but a progression nonetheless. In the introduction to the book, I used the term structural intuitions as a way of trying to capture what I felt about the way in which art and science relate as I'm interested in it. I'm not so much interested in influence. Obviously, science has an influence upon art and artists, and to some extent, in particular instances, art production has an influence on science. But that seemed to me to be a less interesting question than to get underneath and to say, are there shared intuitions? Is there anything which artists and scientists share in their impulse, in their curiosity, in their desire to make images? So that's the question. And I felt the term structural intuitions is not a formula that gets easy understanding, but it was a way of having a phrase which captured what I was interested in. What I'm interested in is the profound interaction between structures that are apparent in the organization of nature. Complex structures, simple structures, but this sense that we can get a feeling that there is some order out there, that it isn't just random. And the way in which our brains are structured, historically evolutionary structured, to make sense of that order, to extract them, the interplay between the structures we have in here and the structures out there. Not static structures, but dynamic structures. So I'm interested in that interplay, and I think artists and scientists are both in that business. They're both saying, look at that, isn't that interesting? How they explore it, how they develop it, how they exploit that is obviously very different, particularly the vehicles they use. But I think there is often a shared itch of looking at something in wonder and saying, I really want to know what that is about, whether it's a flame leaping in a fire, water moving in a river, or how a tree grows. And many scientists, not all scientists, many scientists start with that fundamental feeling that there is something wonderful, fascinating, awesome. And many artists start in the same point. And I think they're both starting with intuitions about processes and structures, about order and disorder. So the structural intuitions is a way, in 2 words, of summarizing that sense. To give a concrete example, it's easy to talk in abstractions, but the lecture is mainly going to be about concrete examples. Let me take what was one of the most surprising and delightful episodes in the whole of my writing in Nature. I wrote about a youngish British artist who, amongst other things, made dust landscapes. These landscapes were made, and you can see one of them there, like a sort of very dense mountainscape, actually a bit like Leonardo backgrounds, now I think about it, by taking a sheet, a steel plate or some kind of plate, and making holes not at regular intervals, not randomly, but not making them at regular intervals, and putting a layer of dust, sieving a layer of dust onto the plate, and obviously it drops through the holes. This is the setup from the side, leaving these patterns, this strange landscape. Very beautiful. One filled a whole room, and it was wonderfully calm, wonderfully complex, and wonderfully simple, all at the same time. Now, I said to him, this reminds me of what then was quite a new theory, the theory of self-organized criticality, which is the model of a sand pile, that if you drop sand, it will, as you know, make a pile, a triangular pile, and the avalanches are unpredictable. There are probabilistic things going on, but basically when the pile collapses and turns into a different cone is not precisely predictable. So I related this, and he didn't know that. And this wasn't the issue involved. I wasn't trying to prove whether he was ignorant or whether he studied science. But he had a sense that there was something wonderfully interesting in the shapes and patterns that emerged from this process of powder dropping through holes and leaving mountains and leaving actually elliptical boundaries between them. Now, when this was published in Nature, an astronomer wrote in from the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, as it happened, in Scotland. And taking the illustration I had shown from the top, I said to Jonathan, let's photograph it from the top as well, because I was very interested in this cellular structure. Not just mountains, but if you look at it flat on, you've got cells and cell divisions. So I'll get this right in a minute. And Jonathan Webster from Edinburgh wrote in and said, from the top, these are what we call Voronoi cells, discovered by the mathematician Voronoi. And it works as follows. At the top, you've got a series of holes, and then you plot which of the which particle in which place goes to which hole. And they go to the hole according to a kind of cellular structure. So the walls you see drawn there, basically if it's to the left of the wall, it will go to the hole to the left and to the right and so on. So it's a cellular structure which is dictated by the hole or the vacuum. And at the bottom you see a Voronoi tessellation, a cell structure, which is founded upon the analysis of which hole a particle will go to. And this, of course, is exactly what is happening in Jonathan Callan's dustscapes. I didn't know that. I knew about self-organized criticality. I didn't know about Voronoi cells. And Adrian Webster pointed out that one of the models of the organization of galaxies says that they are a Voronoi sponge or foam, i.e. three-dimensional version of this flat system, and that the galaxies are arranged along the cell walls, as it were. And this, for me, was just wonderful, both because this very simple process of creating a work of art through a physical process had got into basic patterns of organization which range from potentially small cellular organization to the biggest organization we conceive of, that is to say the galaxy is organized as a cosmic foam. And one of the things which emerged, I think, very delightfully for me was that so many of these intuitions are without scale. That's to say they go down to the smallest organizations we can discern, and they go up to the biggest organizations we can discern, and all the intermediate steps. And this, in a way, this really pure chance, in a way, that the Voronoi cells and the cosmic organization came in, it led on in its turn to Ian Stewart writing about this in Scientific American. So Jonathan Callan's little bits of dust ended up by having very wide consequences. Another artist I have written about and worked with was looking at similar phenomena. Let me go past that one. An artist who makes mainly photograms, that is to say not photographs, but prints made directly from the phenomenon. An artist called Susan Durgis, who works in Devon. And she had made a series of works in which underneath the surface of flowing water, she had put large slides with photographic paper in, about 3 meters wide and the 1.5 meters across. A kind of like about 2 meters wide, about like a big human body, basically. And she put these beneath the surface of the water at night and then took flashlight photographs through the water. And what this did was to pick up what hydraulic engineers, fluid mechanics people are interested in, the standing waves. You also got the shadows of leaves. They end up by looking immensely like Japanese screens, as it happens. And Susan is very interested in Japanese art, which is another story. But if you look into the detail, and that's a detail of one of her black and white ones, you see in this pattern of chaotic water, moving pattern of water, you've got a kind of internal cellular structure. It looks as if it's a photograph of the human skin or a tissue. And again, you have this sense that things, the structures and the intuitions about structures don't just go across scales, they go across different materials. Susan, as it happens, Susan Durgis is immensely interested in science and very well read in the sciences of complexity, chaos theory, fractals, and so on. But she's not making works on that theme. She is interested in that kind of thing. So she's not influenced by chaos theory in that literal sense, but she sees how it speaks to her interests. Now, many of the ways we now get, and have since the 19th century, get at structures have involved instruments of one sort or another, and photography, which I know is one of the great interests in the Iconic Turn program, is very much part of this. The sorts of things which could not be seen before photography had got fast enough to capture the phenomena. These famous images of splashes, we all know what a splash in milk looks like. It's a very famous image. It's an iconic image, to use the term from the lecture. And these are the earliest ones. These are by Arthur Worthington from 1908. The more famous ones, which are turned into posters, are the ones by Harold Edgerton at MIT in his Strobe Alley, along with moving bullets and all these other images which he broadcast so spectacularly. But this is as early as 1908. This, interestingly, was picked up by D'Arcy Thompson, the great Scottish biologist, a fellow St Andrean who worked in the university I worked in, who wrote this extraordinary book, enormous inspiration to artists and engineers, On Growth and Form, in 1917. And Thompson, in a very beautiful passage, illustrating Worthington's splashes, he later, in a later edition, illustrates Edgerton, but he begins by illustrating Worthington, says that a pot, that is to say, a ceramic thrown on a wheel, is like a stilled splash. Beautiful, beautiful insight. And looking at that corona, he could see that it had resonances with other things, and with things of the hand responding to the clay. And it's exactly that kind of thing I'm interested in. It doesn't prove anything, but it's a starting point for a series of explorations as to how structures and structural intuitions work. The images become completely iconic. Milk delivery tankers in the southeast of England are adorned with a rather illiterate version of the Edgerton splash. It's become a kind of Mona Lisa of hydraulics, this particular image. It relates, of course, to a very long-standing sense that artists, like scientists, want to get inside the structure of the phenomenon. The obvious point to turn in historical terms, for me most naturally, but I think the obvious point anyway, is with Leonardo, where Leonardo is continually asking about the structure. These are not straight observations. These are full of ideas about how water should work, as well as how it does work, and how bubbles work. So they are very much constructed, analyzed image. Leonardo, like Dürer, never looked at anything without systematically analyzing it along the way. The art of drawing for Leonardo, as for Dürer, is an art of analysis, an art of understanding, and not an art of portrayal. It has that quality to it, and that's why they both, in their own ways, are great scientists, to use an entirely anachronistic term. For Leonardo, there is the obvious quality which we've noted with someone like Susan Durgis's work, that he moves laterally. He writes, the motion of water is like the motion of hair. The weight of the water, the weight of the hair and the direction of the water are the equivalents. The tendency of water to revolve when it hits an obstacle, the tendency of hair to curl, are similar motions which result in vortices or helices or spirals. So he's looking, and here is a Leonardo drawing for the wig, as it happens, for the head of Leda. The wig engineer, the engineer of a wig, works with the same principles, the same structures as nature herself works in the turbulence of water. The search for structures in fluid phenomena, in these very elusive, slippery phenomena, has been a tremendous motivating force, and resulted in D'Arcy Thompson in some of his most beautiful insights. He looked, for instance, on the right, and I'm sorry that is rather a dark slide, at the way in which the movement of water or the movement of thick substances, fluid substances in water, or thinner fluid substances, produce these magical shapes which themselves look like marine organisms, look like polyps and medusoids. He's not proving anything by this. And for long it was an accusation against Thomson that it was so what science. You know, the parallels are suggestive. Of course, now with modern methods of analysis, you can begin to get at some of the reasons why these structures are similar. But there's an intuition there that forms in water, thick stuff in thin stuff, adopts through process, through a natural patterning, certain shapes. Similarly, he looked towards the spectacular experiments on soap films performed by Plato. On the left, showing the way in which, if you have a wire cage, soap films adopt these amazing geometrical configurations. And drawing parallels with the microorganisms. He was particularly taken by Ernst Haeckel's images of radiolaria, and saying, in the engineering of the soap bubble, the frame and the forms in tension, is there not some common factor with a Nacellarian skeleton of this type, Kalamata Agnese? Is there not something which we can learn about the way in which things organize themselves to work with natural forms, natural engineering structures, and the necessity of natural law? This kind of insight was picked up avidly by artists. I think for a time artists, including Jackson Pollock, interestingly, consumed Darcy Thompson's On Growth and Form more avidly than biologists did. It took some of the new biologists to reintroduce Thompson ideas. The Russian emigre sculptor, Naum Garbo, working in St. Ives, was introduced to Darcy Thompson by Hubert Reid, the art critic, and by one of the Scottish artists working in St. Ives, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, who'd actually known Darcy Thompson. Garbo, in his constructivist sculptures, uses exactly this repertoire of forms under tension and forms under tension in grids. He's not copying Haeckel, he's not copying Thompson, but the principles of the engineering of the object are absolutely those understood via Thompson-type engineering or Plateau soap bubbles. Garbo himself was trained as an engineer, and I think it shows. And often people go into these professions precisely because they have that feeling. I think it's no accident that Garbo is an engineer. And a number of the scientists we'll later be seeing showed very early in their careers an interest in design, in graphics, and a talent for three-dimensional modeling of a very special kind. To take another example, which comes from the later series in Nature, of how, in this case, an architect, not just an engineer, gets an almost bodily sense for how structures work, for structural intuitions. The example I'm choosing is the extraordinary church by the Catalan architect Antoni Gaudí in Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia, the Church of the Holy Family, still being built, but one of the most extraordinary works of European Art Nouveau, Jugendstil, whatever one likes to call it. The work, as you see, still going on. Now, I was fascinated when I went round the display which attached to this. First of all, I think he almost certainly knew Ernst Haeckel. He was immensely interested in Haeckel's images of natural engineering and Kunstformen und Natur, the whole question of art forms in nature. But in this case, the structural principles he worked on were those of an extraordinary insight to say, how can you design an arch in which all the forces are contained within the arch? A semicircular arch won't do that. And he said the way to do this is to adopt a catenary curve. This is what happens if you take a chain, and you hold it from 2 points, and it makes a curve. Now, all the forces must necessarily be resolved within that curve. So he said, why don't I design the building, the vaulting patterns, upside down and hang weights from them equivalent to the weight of the masonry in order to see what curves they adopt. And if I turn the whole thing upside down using these catenary curves, then the weight will be, the forces will be contained within the profile of these curves. And this is not the original Gaudi model, it's a reconstructed one. But it is an extraordinary vaulting brilliance, vaulting insight, to think you can actually get the structural principles of a catenary arch and designing a building by doing it upside down rather than the right way up. But it's a structural intuition. And in this case, I think it's almost bodily. It's physical as much as visual. The sorts of structures he's looking at, both for decorative form and for structural principles, are almost certainly those of Ernst Haeckel in the art forms in nature, these real revelations of nature's geometric engineering, things which are, I think, as extraordinarily beautiful to us now as they were when they were first discovered. And there's a recurrent thread which I detected certainly from Leonardo, or really from Plato onwards, of an interest in how the regular geometry of solid bodies, the so-called Platonic solids, infuses natural design. Leonardo obviously very much concerned with this. For Plato, the elements were the Platonic solids were related to the elements and the cosmos. They were actual sort of physical realities, as it were. For Leonardo, the beauty and complexity of these simple forms, the way in which you can work variations by truncating them, slicing off corners, by building up things on the faces. On the right, one of his illustrations for Luca Pacioli's book, De Divina Proportioni, this, the manuscript, were published in 1509, and the Leonardo illustrations, which were best known for centuries. And on the left, a series of freewheeling variants upon the regular solids. Leonardo is one of those remarkable people who could do geometrical sculpture in his head and so draw them out. Extraordinary spatial visualization. It was exactly this kind of thing which was picked up by Johannes Kepler in his image of the cosmos, envisaging the orbits of the planets as a series of nested spheres and Platonic solids. An image of extraordinary beautiful. Mysterium Cosmographicum, a wonderful title for a book. His later book on world harmonies abandons this system as it happens, but it doesn't alter the basic brilliance of the three-dimensional insight into the possible organization of the cosmic system. Again, scales from tiny to the biggest scales then known, not as big as our universe, but as our galaxies and cosmos, but nonetheless the biggest things they could then conceive. And going down, as people began to look through telescopes and microscopes, the shared structures which were emerging. Robert Hooke's micrographia with this very compelling image. As the microscopists began to look down the ever-improving instrument, so they saw this wonderful world which Haeckel was to enlarge so greatly in his study of the radial area, this wonderful world of micro-engineering. Sort of nanotechnology, I suppose, is the modern equivalent of it, of going down to the smallest things that will actually be stable and hold together. There's a wonderful description in Hooke of this, of how it looks different in different lights and how seeing it is tremendously difficult. And I'll come back to this question of seeing and structured seeing in due course. And that's Hooke Micrographia in 1665, the eye of a housefly. And this sense we find occurring in one of the great iconic figures of modern architectural engineering, Buckminster Fuller. For a historian, this sort of study is very irresponsible because you go across periods, and I like that element of risk. It's full of dangers of eliding things which belong to different cultures, but it's also full of a kind of excitement. It's slightly indecent for a historian to do this, and a bit of indecency is often rather exciting. The Buckminster Fuller Dome at Expo 67 in Montreal, and now we're building, which is a trustee of the British Museum I'm concerned with. This is one of the computer projections. The building doesn't quite look like this, but it gives a good idea of the design phases of it, by Norman Foster. Now, the engineer involved in the British Museum Great Court in putting this extraordinary kind of donut over the round reading room in the court was, well, the engineering firm was Bureau Happold. Ted Happold, now sadly died, was the most avid fan of Darcy Thompson. When he worked as a designing engineer, he was thinking all the time of the design of nature, of things which, both learning from nature and working with nature in a way. And there's a kind of good manners about this sort of engineering because it does work with the spirit of natural design. It may sound rather romantic, but I think it's probably worth saying. And this is a modern engineer doing the most difficult computerized filling of a very difficult space, roofing of a very difficult space, but finding that nature, in the form of Darcy Thompson's nature, still has a lot to learn. And the Buckminster Fuller Dome in particular actually did play a vital role in two very contrasting but interesting scientific discoveries. The first of them is that of virus structures, and the second one is of the carbon C60 molecule. In the 1950s and early 1960s, new staining techniques, negative staining techniques, were beginning to provide a vision as to what viruses look like. And very thrilling they were, because these menacing little things proved to be of extraordinary sort of Platonic beauty, kind of beauty and almost in direct in contrast to our fear of them. But the pictures were unclear. This is from a paper by Wildy, Russell and Horn in 1960. I knew Willie Horn in St Andrews, Willie Russell in St Andrews, and talked to him about this. And in their early search to make sense of these, the capsids, the capsomeres, how these structures worked, this outer coat, what just lies inside the outer coating, they began to think of how do you put polygonal forms together. The ones labelled A there are 5-sided forms, the ones labelled B on the left are 6-sided, but very ghostly. You can now see them in a much better way, but they had to find some way of modelling, of getting some sense as to how you could put pentagons and hexagons together in a unified compressed structure of that way. And two of the people who are working on this, Donald Caspar and Aaron Klug, specifically cited Buckminster Fuller's work on the Archimedean solids and on the geodesic domes as providing a guidance. And when the team working in Glasgow put together the model, they were thinking of those sorts of things, doing the kind of cardboard modelling. Sorry, let me sort that out. This is the model they eventually came up with, but it was the result. This is the model which Willie Russell and his collaborators came up with, but it was very much the result of a lot of trial and error, but thinking around these Buckminster Fuller kind of domes. The second story involves the discovery of C60. Carbon, the simpler forms of carbon are arranged in sheets, and the lattice structure is essentially rather simple. But the empirical evidence showed that there was a carbon molecule which consisted of 70 bits of carbon, 60 bits of carbon, and there's a question of how you arrange them. The team working on this in the structure were led in particular in this modelling technique by Harry Kroto, an English scientist who was working at Rice in America at that time. Harry is the second from the left there in the blue shirt. And he had been to Expo in Montreal, and he had been interested as a young man in training as a designer. He had an enormous natural flair for design and thinking about shape and thinking about spatial form. And it was he primarily, not exclusively, who led the quest to put hexagons and pentagons together to come up with this form. And the form, as we know, became known as Buckminster fullerene, and the whole class of these carbon structures are known as fullerenes, or more vulgarly as buckyballs. They're also the form which footballs used to take at one point, but I think no longer do. But here you see, I'm not so much talking of the influence of Buckminster Fuller, but that he is part of the field of inspiration and parallel thinking. And I think we can get beyond influence in this, that the reason why the Buckminster Fuller domes came in is because there was a quest and an intuition that these structural problems, which make a geodesic dome stable and which make a carbon molecule stable, and which can fit the bits together, work in the same way. What is apparent, I think, in what I've been saying is that these are not just structures out there, but they're also structures of our perception. We need to be able to see them, and we structure our seeing. Our acts of seeing must be hugely filtered in every instance, but in this case they're filtered to draw out certain aspects. And let me just pick up on what is one of the most famous of all acts of structured seeing. Galileo, in the early years of the 17th century, looking down his telescope, or up his telescope, at the moon. A poor quality telescope, he improved the lenses, but nonetheless, compared with modern telescopes, quite a rough device. What he was able to see, and it seems obvious now when he looked down the telescope, was that the moon had mountains and valleys, and that as the sun moved, so little specks of mountains began to appear in the fringes and gradually coalesced with the light areas. Now, it seems obvious to us what the explanation was, but it's only obvious once you've seen it and once your vision is structured in this way. And the other people looking down telescopes, sometimes less good, sometimes as good, couldn't get it. They couldn't snap into that three-dimensional vision. They couldn't get the plastic sense. Now, one reason why Galileo could do it is he was, for a start, a very accomplished draftsman. These are his own watercolour drawings, and you don't draw like that unless you're pretty good. So the act of drawing, as I said with Dürer and Leonardo, is an act of analysis. And Galileo was used to using drawing in that way. But he also knew, in some detail, the analysis and perspective books of complex bodies with shadows. This is from a book he undoubtedly knew. It's Daniele Barbaro, his book on perspective from 1569. And a masterly kind of virtuoso performance of a solid geometrical body, and more complicated than the Platonic solids. But it was because he was able to get a grip of what happened to light and shade on an irregular surface, whether it's a human head or an artificial object like this, that he was able to throw his seeing into relief, literally throw it into relief. Once you've seen it, of course, like all these illusions or perceptions, you've got it. You can't get rid of it in a way, but getting it in the first place is not as easy as it looks. In the 19th century, still the same kind of skills were needed. Until men went on the moon, you always had to look at a photograph or an image of the moon and create some kind of visual analogy. You had to say, well, that looks like. It looks like something I have seen elsewhere. This image is by one of the famous 19th century photographs of the moon by Warren de la Rue and Joseph Beck, and it was illustrated in what I think is one of the most beautiful of all early books, illustrated science books illustrated with photography. James Naismith and James Carpenter, The Earth Considered as a Planet, a World and a Satellite, published in 1874, and they illustrated this. But they said, how can we understand what this looks like in terms of the process of the formation of the moon? And one of the processes is to think about a core with a skin. What happens when the core is still mobile or contracts, but the skin is set? And they produce images which, to use the cliche, are worth more than 1,000 words. They produced, James Naismith, incidentally, was the son of Alexander Naismith, who was the greatest Scottish landscape painter of his time, and James Naismith was a brilliant draftsman, as all the Naismith sons and daughters were. James Naismith was literally the father of Scottish landscape painting, as he produced a whole brood of children who did landscapes. But he himself was an engineer, very sophisticated draftsman, and working with James Carpenter, who's a professional astronomer, he thought of ways of visualizing what happens with a body which has a skin and then it contracts inside. An illustrator shrunk an apple, which makes the point with extraordinary eloquence about how a rough object comes about. And one which now, as I begin to get older, has sort of somewhat uncomfortable resonances, a human hand with the skin no longer having the elasticity which it had when it was young. And this is a good illustration of something which I mentioned earlier, that some of the structural intuitions are physical. They're not just seen. To think about this kind of thing, you have to have a kind of empathy and an intuition about structure, about the malleability of things, the stiffness of things, the fluidity of things. We know that Einstein worked a lot with somatic intuitions, bodily intuitions, because the things he was dealing with were essentially not seeable in the obvious way. The greatest, or the most famed act, if not the greatest act of 20th century biological visualization also works very much in that way. That is to say, the teasing out of the three-dimensional structure of DNA in 1953, the 50th anniversary next year is going to see us all saturated with things about Watson and Crick and DNA. I suspect by the end of it we'll be happy to get away from the double helix for a time, but anyway, it's still a fresh topic at the moment. And the problem is that the data is X-ray diffraction data. That is to say, it is based upon the deflections of X-rays going through a molecule and taking a path. And what you end up with is the flat trace of these series of very complex three-dimensional events. It's very similar in principle to the way in which astronomers had designed astrolabes. To project the celestial sphere, the sphere of the planets, onto a flat surface for an astrolabe or onto a flat map, you took a projection point and basically you took the lines through and then you mapped out where they hit the flat plane. This is Daniele Barbaro again. This is the image, this is the author who I said Galileo looked at for the understanding of solid bodies. Just to remind you, this is what the face of an astrolabe looked like. Now, essentially, what somebody faced with an X-ray diffraction picture on the right was faced with doing is the equivalent of deducing the three-dimensional structure of the planetary system from an astrolabe. That's to say, going from the flat to the three-dimensional. It's actually even more complicated because the geometry of the deflection is not as regular as the perspectival projection of the astrolabe, but the essential thing is like that. And it's a tough job. You know, if you said to somebody, you know, get back to the cosmos from that flat projection, you need to know a lot of information to be able to do that. But that is essentially what they did. There are intermediate stages in creating these models. This is one where John Kendrew was involved in whale hemoglobin and built up, using sheets of lucite, sheets of translucent material, a series of spatial slices of the density of the electrons. That's to say, you could, by laying these slices, build up a picture of where the density of the electrons were. And he described in a very beautiful way how you made sense of these. He said, if you look at these electron density models, these three-dimensional translucent models, from some positions they look chaotic. There is no order in them. But it's like driving past a forest which has been planted with regular trees, that at a certain point, as you're going by, you suddenly see the rows, or you suddenly see the diagonals. And he said that looking at a lucite map was like that you suddenly got that point where things snapped together and you suddenly saw the organization. So the mind is prepared and waiting for the structure. And in this case, it's the movement of the viewer past the forest or past this that gives the structure. And it was on these electron density maps that his great illustrator, Irving Geist, did these extraordinary images of molecules. These are pre-computer. Computer aesthetics of molecular modeling picked up very much from Irving Geist. But extraordinary acts of representation. Geist himself was a designer and illustrator of unquestioned genius. So when we look at the way in which Rosalind Franklin and Ray Gosling's X-ray diffraction was handled by Watson and Crick, we have to think about this mode of getting from a flat image to structure. To do that, it's at least as difficult as Kepler's vision of the orbits of the planets as nested inside as Platonic solids. They are extraordinary acts of mental modelling, not just physical modelling. On the left, the famous Barrington Brown photograph, which was staged. This wasn't the announcement, it was staged later. And on the right, the model, which is now in the Science Museum in London, compiled partly from plates of the original model, which ended up in America. And the interesting thing for an art historian is that this model is now composed from bits and pieces with added elements. It's exactly like a Greek pot. You know, archaeologists can take a Greek pot for the shards and assemble it put them in the shape of the pot. In a way, the Watson and Crick model, which was dismantled and bits of it lost, has now been treated like a reverent artifact, and is now in a museum as a great cultural icon. The essay I'm writing for the Nature publication celebrating the 50th years is called The Mona Lisa of Modern Science. And it is an image which has achieved that kind of status. It is now, the double helix is used in all sorts of things, in jewellery and perfumes. Bijan or Bijan, I don't know how to say it, make a DNA perfume. inevitably the bottle is in the form of a double helix. Well, this is 50 years ago. What's happening now? You've seen two artists, two youngish British artists who I personally work with doing this. And let's just take two international examples to finish with, to say the same thing is happening, but with different kinds of insights, but the principle is the same. The first is a man who taught professional mathematics, topology, who taught the mathematics of curved surfaces, Hellerman Ferguson, taught the mathematics of Mobius strips, toruses, sinks, and all these strange structures which topologists like, these strange continuous surfaces which have such complex mathematical formulae. Working also as a sculptor. Well, perhaps also is the wrong word. I mean, it's not an either or. This for him is a seamless and continuous thing. This marble sculpture, based upon very elaborate topological mathematics, is called Whale Dream. Nice title. Getting a sense, in a very suggestive way, the whale dream, a kind of notion of the fluidity, very like Thomson, the fluidity of organic form and the fluidity of the medium. And one very recent one, a pavilion, temporary summer pavilion erected in Hyde Park by the Serpentine Gallery, actually outside, and it served as a kind of outside tea room, by the Japanese architect Toyo Ito and the London-based engineer Cecil Balmond of Arup. Balmond himself is an extraordinarily interesting figure, with a lot of interest, given his own background, in non-Western geometries and non-Western philosophies, and a huge interest, almost needless to say, in Darcy Thompson. So here you've got a Japanese architect searching for a new vocabulary of form, and Cecil Balmond able to relate that to natural form and also to some of the traditional Islamic and other patterns. The way this is designed is they took a basic square unit, revolved the square by a third, and kept doing that, revolved an inscribed square by a third. You end up with iterating this, repeating it, you end up with a kind of fractal pattern. They then took this sheet, this kind of fractal sheet, and wrapped it over a half cube and found the structural properties just what they needed. There is no post and lintel. There is nothing you see round this wall of verticals holding up horizontals. But using this system of iteration, they didn't, I think, yes, they did use computer, but you could do it by hand if you had enough time. But it's a system of fractal design which has produced a new repertoire of architectural form. Excellent pavilion, was it has a kind of joyous quality, and the light coming through in those few days when the sun shines in London was extraordinarily beguiling. So the structural intuition here is producing something very different from Gaudi and his catenary arch, but I maintain the principle is the same. That structural intuition doesn't produce a definite outcome. It is a way of thinking and a way of envisaging and a way of visualizing. For me, looking at these, and I've just given you a quick tour of some related things, it's clear that in art, science, architecture, engineering, that the potential of our ability to intuit structure, how things work, static and dynamic, is infinite. And this is, I think, an appropriate note on which to finish a lecture series which is knowingly looking into the third millennium. Thank you.
So thank you for that fascinating lecture. We don't have, as we began a little bit late in order to collect people who dropped in, we just have another quarter of an hour, and I will just ask you one question before I open it to the audience. As you don't speak about influences, and as probably there won't be any mystery behind that, I still wonder what might be the real parallels between these sometimes strange, sometimes fascinating, the reasons for these sometimes strange, sometimes fascinating parallels between artistic and scientific approaches. Is it possible to give
to give reasons for these parallels?
Can I answer that in two parts? One is to say I don't avoid using the term influence in a dogmatic way. It's simply in this case one of the things which is said is how has art influenced science and how has science influenced art. So I thought it was interesting as an intellectual exercise to say let's not deal with influence and see what we get. So partly it's a strategy. But I think when we talk of influence, we are talking in a way about something else which is there, which becomes right at a certain point. So I think we're talking about prepared intuitions where the thing we say influences something comes in at that point and joins with it. Now, if you want to describe that as influence, then I don't object to that. It was really a strategy of mine saying, let's not just ask the question of influence, but obviously in structural intuitions and the transfer between the different areas, influence is one way of getting at it. It was just I was trying to do something slightly different from that. And I think it's a question that if somebody is working on a set of problems, let's take, say, Gaudi, thinking about structures of vaulting, and he is ready for Ernst Haeckel's books, which suddenly come as a revelation. It's, I can see that. It's what I call the aha moment, when you're getting somewhere, and then suddenly you can see how to do it. You go, aha, I've got it. And I think very often influence is like that, and it comes in as the thing which produces that, like the Buckminster Fuller one, that when Harry Kroto thought back to the Buckminster Fuller dome, he had that sudden thing, aha, I know how to get hexagons and pentagons together. And I'm not making that up, because I know Harry Kroto and I asked him about it, and that, this is how it went. And so I think influence is not a bad word, but it doesn't quite do the job.
So I note that I asked only one question. We have a lot of natural scientists among us, and I suppose there are not many art historical lectures which might also be interesting for natural scientists. So I open up that discussion and I say that we still have another good 10 minutes. Are there any questions? And you have to move your hand because it's hard to see it from here.
We have one on the left.
There's one.
Science in the arts was an important issue in a certain period in the German art of the 20th century. Just mention Max Ernst, or Paul Klee, who was very much aware about psychophysics and other things, and that has changed very much in the second half of this century. And myself, as a neurobiologist and natural scientist, was always surprised that our world that is so full of science, and where science plays such an enormous role in everybody's life, it did not play a role in the arts for years. I would say between 1950, 60, and 80, almost 90, there were two issues. One was just the aesthetics, as always for art, and the other one was political protest, almost an agitprop type of art that we had here. I found it very different in America. As a member of the New York Academy of Science, I'm getting this wonderful bi-monthly journal, the Sciences, and practically all scientific articles there are illustrated by contemporary artists. So that's different, and I think it's also different in your country. And could you comment on this lack of impact of the sciences on the arts, or on artists, I should say?
I think what you said is absolutely right. I agree with that broad framework you've set down. And I think it's, before talking about the situation in Britain, I can't address the situation in Germany, though I do actually work with one German artist who I'll speak about. What we saw from the 19th century onwards was all the professions establishing their institutions, their jargon, and their discreteness, where you identified yourself by your professional language, by your professional education, and it is a very divisive thing, for good professional reasons, but it's divisive nonetheless. And I think the art of high abstraction in the 20th century, in a sense, was an attempt to make art into its own kind of science, but without having any reference to science, if that makes sense. That it became laboratory art, very specialized, and it's art about art. Now, I'm not criticizing abstract art, as some people like Rothko and so on, I think are just wonderful. But I think it was interesting that that kind of art was very much allowing the art world to say the painting is a painting is a painting, and it's a specialized thing. And I think naturally after a time that becomes unsatisfying, and I think there are young artists in America, as you say, and in Britain, who are saying, maybe we can indulge with social themes, but look at this visual stuff that's going on in science. How can I understand this? Is this not something which is shaping our lives and needs to be addressed? So there are a good number of artists I work with regularly in exhibitions who are researching artists, who work with scientists, not just to do scientific iconography, but to get insights, the sort of things I've been talking about. The German artist I mentioned is Gerhard Lang, who works particularly around faces and physiognomics and facial perception. And he's both working very traditionally because he's working with the old idea of animals and physiognomics, but also picking up on Galton and facial mapping. And the Galton project in London is still a very current project. So the way we work with artists in exhibitions, we helped Gerhard get into the Lombroso archive in Turin, which then was closed. We put him in contact with the Galton researchers, and there's a dialogue. And I'm not interested in artists opportunistically adopting things from science, but thinking about what is happening in that area of face and facial perception and so on. So it is happening. It's not the norm, far from it, but I think it's fantastically important, because I think unless we can get these modes of communication, I'm not just thinking of popular science writing, and a lot of that is wonderful and very important, but different ways of creating a dialogue, then I think we're in a disastrous situation. Our education has produced some pretty disastrous situations, but I think there are people who are now beginning to think this actually is simply deadly. It's deadly emotionally, it's deadly culturally, but I think it's also deadly in terms of attitudes to science, attitudes to art. So, if that makes sense.
Any further questions? If not, I would interfere with a practical one. If we know what the aim of the new art history has to be, what would you, in a very, very fundamental and practical sense, recommend as elements of restructuring our subject?
How long have we got? Oddly enough, I don't adhere to new art history or old art history. in a way, that I'm interested in a form of visual history in which the making of art in certain periods itself is conditioned by the notion of art and its institutions. And there are large swathes of what I do, even what would normally be in an art gallery. I'd prefer not to think of them as subjects of art history, but of visual history. And to do that, you use a range of techniques from style history, which I think still is a fantastically potent tool used correctly, not in a limited morphological way, through to aspects of social deconstruction, of patronage, of the sociology of art, of anthropology. And I, like myself, and I think this is the essential for me of visual history, to go in by the visual thing. So I'm not starting, as it were, from, say, the data on society, but I'm starting with an object and saying, why does that look like it does? And you can get into an enormous body of questions, from technical questions to questions of style, to questions of patronage, questions of production, why this has got this name on the outside. So I think what I would say, what distinguishes us, I think, from other historians, is that that's what I start with. And inside this, there is a fantastically rich series of questions. And we don't look at these things often enough. Why has it got this little thing here? Is this because it's got a little groove? I don't know if you can see that. Is it because it makes it easier to hold? Or is it a visual thing? A simple question, but so in a way my method is very messy. It's very untidy, and I quite like that. I think the tidiness can come in at the point you present the results. But I think if you're not messy in your method, then you shut down a lot of things. So I'm happy to be systematic in presentation, which I don't always manage, and very messy in the starting point of simply thinking, what questions can I ask about this thing?
Okay. Happy.
I think what brains are doing is reducing complexity in the visual world, auditory world. And I think this is when you look at the glass, your eyes, your brain is in a permanent process of reduction of complexity. So this is also the job, of course, of scientists, that we reduce complexity and find physical laws. And the examples you gave are mainly, I think, this creating structures in the world of physical forces, like the gravitation or electromagnetic waves and so on. But mainly you gave us examples which were then somehow also found in the arts, which referred to stationarity of the world. Now, complexity reduction, of course, also happens in the dynamic sphere, information processing. And could you comment on this kind of complexity reduction in art, perhaps also in science, in music, in film, in the dynamic arts, perhaps in language?
One of the things I'm interested in is obviously exactly that, and that is to say how good we are at filtering complexity, and I'd slightly quarrel with the term reducing it, maybe understanding it. But one of the differences, to take your question in a slightly different direction, between what an artist and a scientist does with that is that, broadly speaking, and this is a terrifically crude generalization, the scientist is aiming for an explanation which doesn't allow for ambiguity in interpretation. It is leading the spectator towards a set of understandings and conclusions which the scientist believes allow you to understand the structure of that phenomenon. The artist's job may well be more loose than that, and in a way more generous to the spectator, in that you're inviting the spectator in to something which doesn't have a fixed mode of communication. Now, I don't want to get into arguments about whether you can read a scientific article 6 different ways, but I'm thinking more of the intention behind it at this point, and I still do believe in intentions. So that one of the interesting things about some of the sciences of complexity, for instance, is not so much the reduction of complexity, but how complexity can be generated from such simple procedures. And this, I think, has been a fantastically fertile field for artists, because often artists are taking a series of relatively simple procedures. And Jonathan Callan's Dustscape, there's nothing very complicated about taking a sieve and shaking cement dust through a sieve into holes. Yet you end up with something which is unpredictable and amazingly various. So there is a reduction of complexity in one sense, but an infinite body of possibilities. And I think that dialogue, and certainly for artists concerned with these issues, there are artists concerned with lots of other issues, the mathematics of complexity and those sciences which have been dealing with those things are immensely beautiful because they have unpredictable outcomes, and the spectator isn't presented with something which says, this is just it and this is what you get. And I think the great artist, lesser artist as well, but let's take the great artist, where he or she differs fundamentally from a scientist in intention, is that the great artist is generous to the spectator and asks you to come in and to do a lot of work with the artist. The scientist may be very generous in his mode of or in her mode of communication, but they're aiming not to allow you much latitude for what you think. You know, and I'm not saying that pejoratively. You know, it's a different job. So one of the fascinations for me of an artist like Vermeer or Chardin, some of these great magicians of natural imagery, is this extraordinary way, and this is partly the field of neurology and perceptual psychology, that with very economic clues, they can be very generous to you and allow you to come into the act and to complete the viewing. I think the scientific article on the whole stops you doing that. And I say this is not a value judgment, it's just separating it out. But to come back to your question, yes, there is a constant thread of trying to get complexity into some sort of order, but it's also an ability to take simple things and to get complexity out of the simple. So it's a two-way process.
I invite you to one further question. But it's not a must, we can also interrupt here. And I thank Professor Kemp again for this lecture. What will I have to add here? You're all invited, as I suppose, to the Lichthof again. We wish you a happy Christmas and a good New Year. Now waiting for you for the next lecture given by Annemarie Schimmel on the 16th of January, I think. No. Which date is it? Just tell me. The 9th. It's the 9th of January. So not to avoid any misunderstanding, it's the 9th of January. Thank you again and good night.